Picture this. No, thou shalt not kill. No, thou shalt not steal. No divine voice thundering from a burning mountain. Moses climbs Sinai, waits in the smoke, and comes back down with nothing but sunburned sandals and an empty pair of hands. The tablets? Uncarved. The commandments? Unspoken. And down at the base of the mountain, 3 million people shrug and ask, so now what? Welcome to the most terrifying what if in human history. Here's the part nobody talks about. The 10 Commandments weren't just religious law. They were the blueprint that quietly bled into the Magna Carta, into the United States Constitution, into criminal codes across dozens of nations, civilizations that never even called themselves Jewish or Christian. They borrowed the bones without knowing it. So if you pull those bones out, what exactly is left standing? We're about to find out, and the answer is going to make you deeply uncomfortable. Let's set the stage properly, because this isn't just about religion. This is about architecture, the invisible architecture of human civilization. The year is roughly 1446 BCE, give or take a century depending on who you ask. The Israelites have just escaped 400 years of Egyptian slavery. They're exhausted, sun-cracked, hungry, and running on nothing but adrenaline and a promise. Moses climbs Mount Sinai, disappears into a cloud of fire and thunder, and the entire camp waits below, nervous, restless, beginning to pace. The scene is dramatic, enough for 3 blockbuster films. But in our timeline, this alternate, unthinkable timeline, Moses waits on the mountain and nothing happens. No voice, no fire that speaks, no divine hand etching commandments into stone. After 40 days, he comes back down, empty-handed, looking like a man who went to a meeting and found an empty room. The Israelites stare. He stares back. Crickets. Now here's where history quietly starts to unravel at the seams. You see, before the 10 Commandments, law was a brutal patchwork thing. The Code of Hammurabi existed, and that's true, and it had its own sense of order. But Hammurabi's code was transactional. It operated on a sliding scale depending on your social class. Kill a nobleman's son, you die. Kill a slave's son, you pay a fine. Justice wasn't blind, it had very clear favorites. What the 10 Commandments introduced, and this is the part that changes everything, was a moral code that applied universally. Not just to kings, not just to the powerful. A code that looked at the shepherd and the pharaoh and said, the same rules apply to both of you. That concept, radical, almost violent in its simplicity, was the seed of equality before the law. And in this alternate timeline, that seed was never planted. Without that universal moral framework, the ancient world doubles down on what it already knows: hierarchy, power, and the law of the strongest. The idea that a poor man deserves the same justice as a wealthy one, it doesn't just go unexplored. It feels insane. Who would even suggest such a thing? And here's the irony that makes your head spin. The societies that would later borrow from the 10 Commandments to build their legal systems, the Roman Republic, medieval European kingdoms, eventually the architects of modern democracy, they all inherit something subtly different. Not the commandments themselves, but the logic behind them. The logic that says there is a standard higher than the king, higher than the state, higher than any human authority. Remove that logic, and suddenly every king is his own god. Every emperor writes his own commandments, and there's no higher court to appeal to. Ancient Rome, without that thread of influence, becomes something rawer, something less interested in extending rights and more comfortable keeping its boot on the neck of the conquered. The Republic's civic virtue, still there, but thinner, with no philosophical anchor deep enough to hold it when the storms come. And storms, as history insists on proving, always come. The social order that emerges isn't apocalyptic, not yet. Families still love each other, communities still cooperate, but the glue is different, thinner, more fear-based, more I won't hurt you because you'll hurt me back, and less I won't hurt you because it is wrong. That distinction seems small. It is in fact enormous. If this is already making your brain do backflips, good, we're just getting started. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what's coming next is going to completely change how you see the civilization you're living in. Don't miss scene 2. Let's keep going. Without the 10 Commandments, the first domino to fall isn't religion. It's not even law. It's something far more intimate and far more dangerous. It's shame. That might sound strange, but stay with this for a second. One of the quietest revolutions the Ten Commandments created was an internal one. The commandments weren't just enforced by courts or kings. They were meant to live inside a person. They were designed to make a human being feel something when they considered betraying them. Not just fear of punishment, something closer to conscience. That internal voice that says, you know this is wrong before anyone else is watching. In this world without commandments, that internal architecture develops differently. It's not that people become monsters overnight. Human beings are naturally social, and social creatures develop instinctive codes of conduct. Cooperation still exists. Community bonds still form. But the language of morality is different. It's more situational, more flexible, more negotiable. And negotiable morality, history has shown time and time again, has a very specific weakness. It bends perfectly in the direction of whoever is holding the most power at any given moment. Consider what happens in the ancient Near East over the next few centuries. Without a written divine moral code anchoring the Hebrew people, their identity becomes more diffuse. They're still a people. They still have stories, traditions, a memory of Egypt. But the consolidated theological and ethical identity that the Torah provides, that identity doesn't crystallize in the same sharp, resilient way. And a people without a crystallized identity in the ancient world have a much harder time surviving the empires that keep rolling through the region like very large, very violent weather systems. Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. These empires come regardless. But in our known history, the Hebrew people survive each one, absorbed, exiled, scattered, and yet stubbornly, almost supernaturally coherent. Why? In significant part because they carry the Torah with them like a portable homeland. The commandments give them a center that no empire can physically destroy. In this alternate timeline, that center is softer, more porous. The dispersion still happens. The assimilation runs deeper. The distinct moral and theological voice of this people, a voice that would eventually echo through Christianity and Islam and reshape the ethical vocabulary of half the human race, gets blurred at the edges, diluted over generations, until it's just one more regional tradition in a world full of regional traditions. And now Christianity never quite forms the way it did, because the tradition it grows from has mutated beyond recognition, and Islam, which traces its ethical lineage through both Judaism and Christianity, builds on a slightly different foundation, which means three of the world's largest religions, collectively followed by over 4 billion people today, are fundamentally, irreversibly altered by the absence of a single event on a single mountain. 4 billion people, different moral vocabulary, different ethical instincts, different answers to the question, what do we owe each other? So, what fills the vacuum? What does morality look like in a world where no divine code ever claimed to define it universally? What systems rise when the architecture of conscience is built on sand instead of stone tablets? The next scene is going to answer that, and the answer is not what you're expecting. Think about it for one more second before we move forward. Every legal system you've ever interacted with, every courtroom, every statute, every right you assumed was yours, was built by people who were, consciously or not, standing on the shoulders of an idea born on a mountain most of them had never visited, spoken by a voice many of them had stopped believing in, and yet they kept building on the foundation anyway, because once an idea that good enters the bloodstream of a civilization, it tends to stay there, whether anyone remembers where it came from or not. In this alternate world, that idea was still born. The foundation was never laid. And the builders that came after, brilliant, ambitious, deeply human in all their glory and their failures, built. Anyway, they built the best they could, but they built on sand. Let's talk about law, because in this alternate timeline, law doesn't disappear. It mutates. Ancient societies always developed rules, always. The instinct toward order is hardwired into the human species. But the basis of those rules, the reason they exist, that's where everything starts to look profoundly, disturbingly different. In our world, Western legal tradition was quietly shaped by the idea, inherited from the 10 Commandments, that there exists a moral law above human law, a standard that no king, no senate, no emperor can simply override because it suits them. This idea, called natural law in philosophy, divine command in theology, became the intellectual foundation for challenging unjust governments. It's why people could look at a law and say, this law is wrong, not just this law hurts me. Without the Ten Commandments, that concept either never emerges or emerges far later, far weaker from different philosophical traditions. Stoic philosophy flirted with a version of it. So did some currents in ancient Indian and Chinese thought. But without the amplifying megaphone of three major world religions, all reinforcing the same core idea across continents and centuries, the concept stays academic. It stays in lecture halls and philosophical texts. It never becomes the thing that makes a peasant look a king in the eye and say, "You do not have the right." And when peasants can't say that, empires get away with a great deal more for a great deal longer. Look at Rome through this lens. The Roman Republic had already developed sophisticated legal concepts, property rights, contracts, procedures. But even Rome's legal evolution was eventually shaped by Christian natural law thinking as it moved through the medieval period. Take that influence away, and the Roman legal tradition that eventually feeds into European law comes through differently. It's more transactional, more about managing conflict between interest groups, and less about establishing rights that exist independently of what any authority decides to grant. The medieval period in Europe, already brutal enough in our timeline, becomes something considerably darker without the Church's role as a check on kingly power. Not a perfect check, not an uncorrupted check, but a check nonetheless. The idea that even a king answers to God, that even an emperor can be called to account by a moral authority above his throne. This idea, rooted in the commandments, made kings nervous in ways that were occasionally useful for everyone else. In this alternate timeline, the kings are less nervous, the nobles are less accountable, the serfs are less, well, everything. Now here's the WTF moment nobody sees coming, the scientific revolution. You wouldn't think the Ten Commandments have anything to do with science, but follow the logic. The commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me," combined with the theological concept of one rational, orderly creator, gave rise to a very specific assumption. The universe operates by consistent, discoverable laws. God is not capricious. God is orderly. Therefore, the universe can be understood through reason and observation. This assumption drove the entire project of modern Western science. It's why European scientists were motivated to look for laws of nature. They expected laws to exist because their theology told them the universe was lawfully created. In a world without that theological foundation rooted in part in the commandments, the philosophical framework that motivates rational scientific inquiry develops differently, maybe later, maybe through different cultural pathways, maybe with different assumptions about whether the universe even has consistent, discoverable laws, or whether it's just the playground of unpredictable divine whims. The Industrial Revolution, delayed at minimum. The Enlightenment, altered significantly. Because the Enlightenment was in large part a response to religious thought, including thought rooted in the commandments. You can't have the same reaction if the original provocation was different. The entire timeline of human technological development forks at Sinai, and we end up somewhere less advanced, less connected, and far more fragmented than the world you woke up in this morning. Up to now, we've been looking at the big canvas, empires, legal systems, science. But the 10 Commandments didn't just shape civilizations. They reached all the way down into the smallest, most intimate unit of human life. They reached into the family. Honor your father and your mother. 5 words. Possibly the most underrated commandment of all 10, and, in terms of social engineering, one of the most consequential. Because here's what that commandment actually did. It made the family unit sacred. Not just emotionally meaningful, structurally sacred. It created an obligation, not based on feelings, which fluctuate wildly, but on a divine command that existed whether you felt like honoring your parents or not. It said, regardless of circumstance, regardless of emotion, this relationship carries weight. The family, in virtually every known human civilization, has been the foundational building block of social order. Before states, before laws, before religions even took their organized forms. The family was the original government, the original economic unit, the original welfare system. And the commandment to honor parents essentially placed the divine stamp of approval on that structure. In our alternate timeline, family structures still exist, but without that divine mandate, the cultural pressure to maintain them looks very different across different societies. In some cultures, it might be stronger. Ancestor worship traditions in East Asia, for example, don't rely on this commandment. In others, particularly in the cultures most directly influenced by the Hebrew tradition and its offspring, the weight of familial obligation becomes more negotiable, more dependent on individual feeling, more fragile under pressure. And pressure is something history applies constantly, without asking permission. When societies face stress, war, famine, economic collapse, one of the first things that tends to fracture is the family unit. The commandment to honor parents functioned as a kind of social shock absorber, a cultural imperative that kept families intact, under conditions where pure self-interest might otherwise cause fragmentation. Without it, or without the tradition that carried it into secular culture, even after people stopped attributing it to divine command, that shock absorber is thinner. The social contract between generations becomes more conditional. The care of the elderly becomes more transactional. The passing of wisdom between generations becomes less formalized, more subject to the whims of individual relationships. Here's the dark irony. In a world without the commandment to honor parents, societies likely develop harsher social mechanisms to enforce family loyalty, not out of reverence, but out of sheer practical necessity. You need the elderly to transmit knowledge. You need the young to provide labor and care. Without the cultural glue of religious obligation, those relationships get enforced by economic need and social pressure, which is both less noble and, ultimately, less stable. And you shall not commit adultery. Let's go there, briefly, because it's too important to skip. That commandment didn't just regulate personal behavior. It was a property protection clause for a society where family lineage determined inheritance, land ownership, political succession, and social order. Adultery wasn't just a personal betrayal. In the ancient world, it was a social grenade. In a world where no divine command reinforces marital fidelity as a moral absolute, only as a practical necessity, the pressure on that fidelity is different. The infidelity still happens because human beings are human beings. But the weight of it, the cultural machinery that penalizes it and reinforces the norm, operates differently. Succession disputes become more common. Inheritance systems become more contested. The political stability that flowed from clearly defined family lineages becomes shakier. Some historians might argue this leads to more flexible social structures, and maybe, in some limited ways, it does. But mostly what it leads to is more conflict, more violence over contested claims, more of the baseline chaos that human civilization is always, constantly, laboriously working to reduce. The Ten Commandments were, in part, a tool for reducing that chaos. Remove the tool, and the chaos simply finds its natural level. Let's zoom out one final time. Let's look at the full picture of this alternate world, the civilization that grew in the shadow of an absent moral code. And let's really sit with what we're seeing. By the year 2025 in this alternate timeline, the world is recognizable, but wrong in the way a familiar room is wrong when someone has quietly moved all the furniture 2 inches to the left. You can tell something is off. You just can't immediately identify what. Democracy exists in some form. Humans being social and political animals, experiments in collective governance would still have emerged from Greek philosophy, from Roman republicanism, from various Asian political traditions. But the specific form of democracy most of the modern world adopted, a system built on the premise of inalienable rights, of human dignity that no state can revoke, of equality before the law, that form owes a profound debt to the natural law tradition rooted in monotheistic theology, rooted in turn, at least partly, in the Ten Commandments. The founding fathers of the United States explicitly appealed to a creator who endowed people with rights. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man appealed to a moral order above the state. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, speaks of the inherent dignity of every human being, a concept that finds its deepest philosophical roots in the idea that every person is made in the image of a God who commanded, "You shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." Remove those roots, and the tree of universal human rights either doesn't grow or grows into something considerably different. Something that looks like rights, but is actually just a more sophisticated version of the law of the strongest, dressed up in the language of philosophy. In this alternate 2025, international law is weaker. The concept of human rights is less globally coherent. There are still great powers who sign declarations and promptly violate them. That's true in our world too. But in this world, there's even less shared moral vocabulary for challenging them. The key philosophical tools for saying this is universally wrong are blunter, less sharp, harder to wield. War crimes trials never quite become what they became after World War II. The Nuremberg tribunals, which relied heavily on the concept of crimes against humanity, a concept that assumes universal moral standards, never establish the same precedent. Because if morality is purely cultural, purely relative, then you can't judge a nation by standards it never agreed to. The logic collapses. The trials still happen. The victors always put the vanquished on trial, but the moral architecture behind them is different, weaker, less capable of establishing lasting international norms. Genocide still happens. Slavery still happens. Persecution still happens. These things happen in our world too, with all the commandments having been given, all the moral tradition having been built, all the philosophy having been developed. But in this alternate world, the vocabulary for condemning them, universally, the shared human language that says no, this is wrong, full stop, no exceptions, regardless of who's doing it or why. That vocabulary is rougher, less developed, less widely shared. And here's the moment that hits you like cold water: the Holocaust. In our world, the Holocaust happened despite centuries of moral tradition, despite the commandments, despite the theology, despite all of it. That's the haunting, devastating truth. In a world without the commandments, the question isn't whether something like it still happens. The question is whether the world even has the moral language to recognize it as something that should never happen. Whether "never again" is a sentence anyone even knows how to mean. That's not a comfortable place to sit. But you should sit there for a moment, because the weight of it tells you something real about what was at stake on Sinai. So here we are, end of the road, or the end of a road that, in another universe, was never built at all. Let's be honest about what we've just traveled through. We started with a mountain, a man, and an empty pair of hands. We ended somewhere considerably colder, considerably more fragile, considerably more human, in all the ways that word can break your heart. Because this is what this alternate history reveals. Not that the 10 Commandments were perfect, not that the traditions built around them were without flaw, not that every culture that carried them did so with clean hands and pure motives. History is messier than that, and you know it, and I know it. What this alternate history reveals is that certain ideas, once introduced into the human story, become structural, load-bearing. The kind of ideas that you don't notice holding up the ceiling until you try to remove them. And suddenly every wall in the building shifts and groans, and you realize with a cold clarity that you were never actually looking at the walls. You were looking at what the walls were holding. The idea that every human life has inherent worth, load-bearing. The idea that there is a standard of justice above the strongest man in the room, load-bearing. The idea that even power has limits, that even kings can be wrong, that even the majority can be wrong, load-bearing. All of it running in ways direct and indirect, sometimes twisted beyond recognition, sometimes stripped of its original theological context and carried forward in purely secular form. All of it running back to a mountain in the Sinai desert, where, according to one of the oldest and most influential stories in human civilization, a voice spoke and was answered. Now, here's the twist nobody expected. Here's the thing that keeps philosophers and historians and theologians arguing at dinner tables and conference rooms and late-night seminars. The commandments were never meant to be what they became. They were given to one people, in one place, at one moment in time, as part of a covenant, a specific agreement between that people and their God. They weren't handed to all of humanity like a press release. They weren't broadcast. They were given quietly on a mountain to a group of exhausted former slaves. And yet, somehow, they traveled, they spread, They seeped through the ground of history like water through rock, slow and inevitable, reshaping every formation they touched. They became, without anyone quite intending it, the moral backbone of half the world's legal systems, 3 of the world's largest religions, and the philosophical foundations of modern human rights. All from one moment, one mountain, one man with empty hands. But in our timeline, not empty for long, which means the deepest, most unsettling conclusion of this entire thought experiment isn't about the commandments themselves. It's about the nature of foundational moments. The idea that history, for all its complexity, for all its millions of actors and forces and contingencies, sometimes pivots on single events. That a conversation on a mountain, an unverifiable, ancient, contested, miraculous or mythological, depending on who you ask, changed the world more completely than any army, any empire, any invention, any discovery in human history. And if that's true, if one absent moment could have produced this much darkness, then it's worth asking what moments in your life you've been treating as optional that might in fact be structural. What conversations you've been putting off. What things you know to be true that you keep leaving unsaid. The tablets were carved in stone for a reason, not because stone lasts forever, but because some things, once written, are meant to be carried everywhere you go. This has been What If? If this episode changed the way you see the world, even for a second, share it with someone who needs to have their mind rearranged. Subscribe if you want more alternate histories that make history feel less like the past and more like a very close call. And as always, the question isn't just what if, the question is what now?